the freeze-outs, the roster departures, the rumors. One Championship enters 2024 intent on reviving their MMA divisions, but how exactly will they do that? What even happened last year? Has any major MMA promoter changed their identity as drastically as One Championship has in such a short amount of time? I don't think so. Honestly, for me, One Championship is one of the most interesting, intriguing promotions to follow in all of combat sports because of how much they change. They're always trying new and interesting things, and I can't say that I always agree with what they're doing, but nevertheless, it's really interesting for me to follow the promotion. When they started in 2011, they were basically just an Asian-focused MMA-only promotion, and now 11, 12 years later, they have 4 sports under their umbrella. They've got MMA, kickboxing, Muay Thai, and grappling. They have a globalized roster. They've stated their intentions of hosting shows not only in Asia, but in the Middle East, in Europe, and the US. They are scaling so big so quickly. And I think like a lot of you, in 2023, I kind of looked at the MMA schedule that they had going on, waiting and wondering, when is this title going to be defended? When is this person going to fight? And it hardly ever happened. And personally, I wanted to actually look at the data, look at the numbers of not just this year, but the entire story of One Championship's, like 11, 12-year history, to see what have their patterns been in promoting MMA fights. Was 2023 kind of an anomaly of a year, or is it part of a larger pattern? I felt like something was a little bit different in 2023, so I wanted to see what was actually going on. And so I gathered a lot of data. Hope you're ready for a deep dive. Now, for those of you that are maybe just UFC fans, or for those that love One Championship, hate One Championship, or neutral somewhere in between, you have to admit that the organization plays a really important place in the overall MMA landscape. They have played a really important part in developing MMA talent, especially in Asia. Also, why all of this information matters is because the number of top promotions that MMA fighters can choose is slowly dwindling down. This year we saw Bellator and PFL merge, and in 2024 there'll be one less option for fighters to go. So is One Championship going to re-emerge as a major player in the MMA landscape? You may have to be the judge of that, but I'm going to give you a lot of data and some of my own opinions to help you answer that question. So with all these talks of them potentially focusing once again on MMA in 2024, you've also got these really interesting talks about their finances. It's all really fascinating to me, and so I'm about to jump into some data. Here we go. Oh yeah. All right. First of all, I want to just say that some people will construe this as like a takedown of One Championship. And this isn't meant to be any kind of attack or defense of anybody. It's just trying to show you what the numbers are and the stats. I'm trying to see the bigger story here. Second, I know there's a lot of talk about the financial situations of One Championship. This video is not really going to go into that. However, I will reference a few things from those kind of reporting. I will link to all of those kinds of articles in the description below, so you can check those out, including the responses from Chatri on their financial situation. Now, let me give you just a little bit of guidance on the data that I collected. I'm gonna throw some numbers about different numbers of events and fights that took place every single year under One Championship. This is not going to include different kinds of Road to One events, because a lot of those events are actually co-promoted shows with other organizations, and most likely those events would have continued anyways without the guidance of One Championship. What is included in this tally is the numbered one events or One Championship events with a title, Amazon Prime events, One Warrior Series, and One Hero Series, since those are directly under the leadership of One Championship. I'm also going to break down different numbers of fights and weight classes. I'm going to use One Championship's labels for weight classes, like 77 kgs is lightweight, 83 kgs is welterweight. Title fights that I'm counting is also including interim title fights, and I'm combining cruiserweight and light heavyweight. All right, you ready to look at some data with me? I am ready to take a deep dive, and I'm going to take you with me, and hopefully I don't lose you along the way. Here we go. Taking a look at the first couple years of MMA fights at One Championship, things are pretty straightforward, as you can see. From 2011 up to 2017, things are basically just kind of steadily growing as One Championship is adding more and more weight classes to the promotion. However, you do see that huge spike in 2018 and 2019 where they more than doubled the number of MMA fights that they were putting on. And that is due to the addition of entry-level MMA promotions to One Championship. That's talking about one Warrior Series and one Hero Series. So in 2019, they had 6 One Warrior Series events and 12 One Hero Series events as a means of generating new talent and bringing it into the organization. So actually, One Championship has held about the same number of primary events since 2017 up until 2022, which is about 20 per year. That's talking both like Amazon Prime shows and also the numbered events or events with titles in them. And in 2023, they held 12 Amazon Prime shows and 46 Friday fight shows, so kind of changed it up a little bit. The decrease in MMA fights actually happened right at the pandemic, a couple years before the Lupini deal started. Mostly because when the pandemic happened, all of that entry-level programming like Warrior Series and Hero Series stopped. In 2023, the Friday fight shows basically replaced the role that one Warrior Series and Hero Series had, even though there were still a lot less MMA fights in One Friday fights. Like in 2019, it wasn't totally uncommon to have both Warrior Series and Hero Series events every month that were basically entirely focused on MMA, and each of those shows could have up to 15 MMA fights each. So what One Championship did was they basically cut off the majority of their feeder source for MMA ever since 2020. They brought it back with One Friday fights, but not quite as big as it was before. But even as those numbers have fallen since 2020, the number of MMA fights has actually gradually increased since 2020 year over year. However, that does come with a little bit of a caveat. So in 2023, One Championship put on 131 MMA fights. Of those 131 fights, 70% of them were on One Friday fight shows, which is the entry-level vehicle for One Championship. Where in 2019, that number was down to 48%, or 167 of 349 fights. All that to say, I do expect the total number of MMA fights, both entry-level and on their main shows, to grow again in 2024. All right, now let's take a look at total MMA fights in each division of One Championship. So as you know, One Championship started in 2011, and at that time, they only had 5 weight classes. Now, 12 years later, they've got 13 weight classes that they've promoted fights in. Now, I will show the total number of title fights in each division as well soon, because I think that shows some interesting things as well. So the last graph that I showed you with the total MMA fights every year showed you that every year since 2020, the number of fights has increased. Now, that isn't totally the whole picture, because that isn't even true for every weight class. So as you can see here, it kind of splits off into a couple different weight classes of ones that have increased and not increased. The ones that have increased since 2020, including 2023, is men's flyweight, men's bantamweight, featherweight, and lightweight. So these are the weight classes of the very first one event, excluding welterweight. It's almost like they're hitting a hard reset, isn't it? So the ones that briefly rose but then fell in 2023 were atomweight, men's strawweight, women's strawweight, welterweight, middleweight, light heavyweight, and heavyweight. Heavyweight, by the way, it actually saw a really big boom in 2021, biggest it's ever been, but then it gradually fell in 2022 and 23. Now let's look at title fights per year in One Championship, 2011 to 2023. So like the total number of fights, the title fights also build up to the climax at 2018 and 2019 as more divisions are added, and then they drop off in 2020, slightly decrease in 2021 before spiking in 2022. Now, a couple disclaimers about this data about title fights. Are there factors that take a title off the table for a given amount of time, such as injuries and personal crises like what the Lees experienced this past year? Yes, but champions are shelved all the time, not just in 2023. It's a normal occurrence of MMA for titles to kind of come in and out of the picture. 1 or 2 titles shelved for a year isn't really enough to massively change the data, and interim titles are also counted in the tally. So I didn't really feel like it was bringing up the kinds of issues that could skew the data different ways with titles being taken out due to injury. So the stat that I find the most interesting here is look at 2022. One championship managed to have every single title defended. That's 11 different weight classes defended in 2022. And then the next year, 2023, only 5 title fights took place. And those were, guess which ones, some of the main weight classes that they're sticking around with: men's flyweight, men's bantamweight, and featherweight, bookended by atomweight and heavyweight. In 2023, every other sport in one had more title fights. Muay Thai had 12, kickboxing had 7, and even grappling, their newest sport, had 6 title fights in 2023. All right, so it's obvious that One Championship shelved a big part of their MMA divisions in 2023, but what I didn't know before looking at that data was that a lot of the drop-off actually started around the time of the pandemic. And the reason that happened was because One Championship basically cut out their entry-level promotions like One Warrior Series and One Hero Series. Like in 2022, around 50 to 60% of all of the cards that One Championship put on were still MMA fights. The other thing that really shocked me about those numbers was that the title fights shot up in 2022 to where they had every single belt defended, all 11 of them in 2022, only to drop off to 5 total title fights in 2023. One way you could look at that is that One Championship burned through a lot of their viable contenders in 2022 and didn't have a lot for 2023. Maybe, but I'm not so sure. I think more likely they were just trying to get everyone in rotation in 2022, knowing that they were probably going to take a step back from MMA in 2023. But the problem is that there wasn't a whole lot of movement within the divisions during 2023 to raise up new contenders for 2024. Where does that leave these divisions today? Well, I will get to that, and I'll go through every single division and give them an assessment here in a second. But overall, I would say that One Championship is really trying to give everything a fresh restart and start from the ground up. But the bigger question is, why did they do all of this? Why? Well, a lot of the reasons for that probably exceed the scope of this video, since it definitely probably ties into the financials of the organization and also the overall dream of people like Chatri Sityodong. You could definitely take the saving money angle all of this because MMA fights are expensive. For One Championship, the MMA fighters on their roster are usually the most long tenured athletes that they have, meaning that their contracts are usually a lot bigger, so they're more expensive to promote their fights. Also, just cutting out a lot of title fights out of the picture saves you a lot of money as well. As far as I know, there is no provision in the One Championship MMA fighter contracts that guarantee a certain number of fights per year, like the UFC contracts, where there's something in the contract that says they have to offer you a certain amount of fights per year. One Championship doesn't have that. I think we also have to take a big look at what happened with the One Lupini deal. So the deal saw One Championship hosting events every single Friday for the whole year, only taking off for Thai holidays. In addition, they hosted 9 of 12 Amazon Prime shows, also in Bangkok's Lupini Stadium. This means that they are pivoting hard towards that Thai market, which is sort of already primed to receive Muay Thai and kickboxing well. And since they're hosting all these fights in Bangkok, it means that they have to have a ton of Thai athletes and a ton of Muay Thai fights. But rather than just offering up the existing MMA roster alongside new Thai athletes and Muay Thai fights, they have scaled down their MMA divisions in favor of promoting more Muay Thai fights. The cycle has seen a lot of longtime fighters with One Championship leave the organization, and instead most of the MMA fights of 2023 for One Championship featured either really young or really inexperienced MMA fighters that they could have on short, really cheap contracts. In addition, Muay Thai fights, at least in Thailand, Muay Thai fighters are typically paid a lot less than like your average mid-tier MMA fighter. The best numbers that I could find on the web, at least when I looked at a lot of different sources and kind of averaged things out, out, the average mid-tier Muay Thai fighter in Thailand would make about $450 per fight, and the higher earners can earn up to about $4,000. So you can see why paying athletes more in that range is attractive to a company that's trying to save money. And then you also got to look at hosting the majority of your events in Thailand when you have mostly a Thai roster. That massively cuts down on travel costs as well. So I would just venture to say that a lot of these decisions were motivated by the desire to cut back athlete costs. But I think the big question is, right, is one championship still on par to compete with organizations like the UFC or even PFL, or have they lost their place in that pecking order? Well, it's kind of hard to stay there when you're hardly promoting MMA fights and you're not signing any top talent. One championship's strategy has definitely been to build from the bottom up and release a lot of their top earners. And rather than getting into a bidding war over prospects with the UFC and PFL, which can be really expensive, I think they're just trying to find tomorrow's next star and build them up through their One Friday Fight series. Going after huge prospects and putting them against your own fighters can be really great, but also may not have much of a payout. They signed Roberto Soldic, and he was probably the last fighter that they signed that gathered a lot of headlines when they signed him, and he has not had a great run in the organization. So that's really risky. It makes a lot more sense to build someone up from the bottom up, throw money at them as they prove themselves in your organization. Now, I know some people will say that the absence of high-profile signings within one championship could be due to UFC contracts locking down top talent for long periods of time. Could be, but it's not like one championship has never signed top prospects before. They've totally done it before. And some people might say, well, this wasn't really about just trying to save money and get back in the green. It was more about just trying to focus on other sports that they have and allow them to grow. Well, if that was the case, why didn't they just have more numbered shows? Why didn't they promote MMA fights in their own arena while doing the Muay Thai and kickboxing thing? I don't think that they would have been in competition with each other. And I don't see how one championship would lose out by just adding more title fights to their Amazon Prime shows. Tell me how that would be a loss for them. So I definitely think that money was part of all of this. Now, while they did let go a lot of their high-profile fighters in their organization, they really do have a lot of tremendous fighters that I'm sure could rank in the UFC top 15. I'm thinking fighters like Stamp Fairtex, Christian Lee, Anatoly Malikin, Demetrius Johnson. All of those fighters are incredible, but the question is, do they have fights for them in their future? We'll look at that. So what is one championship actually going to look like next year? Did a year of hiatuses, roster departures, and turnover adequately leave them in a place for them to have a big relaunch in 2024? In an interview with Nick Atkin of the South China Morning Post, One Championship CEO Chatri Sityodong had this to say about 2024. He says they expect to promote between 61 and 70 shows next year. He says they expect to go to the Philippines twice, to Japan twice, to Qatar. That's scheduled for March 1st. He also said they hope to get to both Europe and the US next year as well. And he said, most importantly, that MMA will be squarely into the focus once again, which 61 shows sounds like a lot at first glance, but not when you look back at the year that they just had. They just promoted 58 shows in 2023. That would be 46 One Friday Fight shows and 12 Amazon Prime Fight Night shows. So really, for them to promote 61 shows next year isn't so much of a stretch. They would just have to add 3 more events to their current schedule, and they've already scheduled 2 of those events, with 165 in January and 166 in March. So I don't actually think that's going to be that hard for them to expand the number of shows they plan to promote. So that's great. More MMA shows, bringing MMA back into the focus next year. We love that, right? But what is that actually going to look like when they only had 5 title fights in 2023 out of their 11 divisions? To hold over several of their MMA champions in 2023, they actually promoted them in non-MMA fights, like Jared Brooks and Renier de Ridder fought in grappling fights. Fabricio Andrade fought in a kickboxing fight. So try to keep them busy. Historically, One Championship also likes to have a lot of champ versus champ fights. I think that also, aside from just trying to promote big fights, is to try and slow down divisions and prevent this sort of just perpetual killing off of top contenders one by one and emptying out divisions. So One Championship definitely likes to slow things down a little bit, but what does that leave us with 2024? I do know that a lot of fighters on the One Championship MMA roster have left the organization in 2023, and I know that because I keep a running spreadsheet of their whole roster, and that thing has shrunk considerably over the last year. And you know, like the welterweight and women's strawweight divisions, they used to have rankings, but recently they got rid of those rankings just because the division started getting too thin. So what's next for those divisions? Is there enough going on to promote interesting, compelling title fights in all of these divisions? Well, let's get into that now. One Championship has 11 MMA divisions, but how many of those are actually healthy, thriving divisions? Starting with men's strawweight, Jared Brooks is the champion there, and he has already fought 3 of the top 5. He's going to fight number 1 Joshua Pasio next year again. Gustavo Ballart, number 4, is on a 3-fight win streak and will fight number 3 Hiroba Minowa in January. Mansour Malachiev, number 5, just lost to number 1. So probably after Jared Brooks versus Joshua Pasio 2, we'll get Gustavo Ballart if he wins the fight against Minowa. Minowa is on a 2-fight losing streak and lost to Brooks 2 fights ago, so a rematch seems unlikely if he wins. Going on to men's flyweight, Demetrius Johnson, the champion, has already fought number 1, number 2, and number 4. Reese McLaren, number 3, lost to a fighter who left the organization this year. Hu Yong is a fresh face at number 5 and has hardly fought into the top 5. Kairat Akhmatov should be the next challenger to the belt, but he was removed from the rankings after failing a drug test on May 15th, 2023. But everyone kind of feels like he's supposed to be the next challenger. After that, probably Hu Yong versus a next top contender to decide the next contender. At bantamweight, Fabricio Andrade has already fought number 1 and number 4. John Lineker, number 1, is scheduled to fight in Muay Thai next year. Stephen Lohman, number 2, recently lost to number 1 John Lineker. Bibiano Fernandez was at number 3, but he just left the organization. Kwan Il, number 4, is booked to fight Chinook Chagda Zoltitseg in January, and Artem Balak, number 5, just lost to number 4 Kwan Il. There is no clear contender for the belt at bantamweight, so if Kwan Il wins, he is the only viable contender in the organization currently. At featherweight, Tong Kai has already fought the interim featherweight champion Tan Lei, but he hasn't fought anyone else in the top 5. Gary Tonin, number 1, and Martin Nguyen, number 3, are scheduled to fight. Ilya Freemanov, number 2, just lost to the interim champion Tan Lei. Shamil Gasanov, number 4, just lost to number 1 Gary Tonin and is scheduled to fight unranked Oho Take. Akbar Abdullayev, number 5, is a fresh contender and has not fought anyone in the top 5. Featherweight is the healthiest division in One Championship MMA. Tan Lei is next to unify the belt. Then next is probably the winner of Gary Tonin versus Martin Nguyen. Akbar Abdullayev could be there in a fight or 2. At lightweight, the rankings were actually removed just a few months ago just because the division is starting to really thin out. Christian Lee, the champion, has already fought Okre Yoon twice and Doggy Arsenaliev. Apparently, he's supposed to defend a title in February. He also holds the welterweight belt. The only real contender at lightweight is Halil Amir. Not really sure where they're going to go here at lightweight. At welterweight, Christian Lee has only defended the belt against Kiamran Abasov, a former champion who is also no longer in One Championship. I'm guessing he's going to fight Sebastian Kadastam in his next title defense, seeing as Kadastam is on a win streak and a former champion. Welterweight, another weird division. At middleweight, Renier de Ritter hasn't fought in over a year despite being the champion. He's recently beat both viable contenders, Onglan Song and Vitaly Bigdash, so I have no clue what they're going to do with middleweight. Light heavyweight is even worse. There is no one, literally no one even in the division for Anatoly Malikin to fight. They're going to have to sign someone, or someone's going to have to move up, or I don't know what's going on at light heavyweight. The double champion Anatoly Malikin has already beaten Amir Ali Akbari, though he and Rug are probably the 2 best contenders right now. Most likely he'll fight Ali Akbari if he beats Arjun Buller in March, but that would set the next title defense at heavyweight to next summer at the earliest, unless he has a wild fight against someone like Rug or they sign someone to the organization. Heavyweight is looking a little bit thin right now. Going over to the women's side, at atomweight, Stamp Fairtex has already fought number 1 Hamza Sohee, number 3, Aliona Rasahina, and number 5, Jin Radzuan. So honestly, Denise Zambawanga, number 2, is the clear contender for the belt. She's just on a 2-fight win streak despite only one distant win over a ranked foe in Jin Radzuan. I don't know if they're going to make that fight next or not. Tiffany Teo, number 4, hasn't fought in well over a year and doesn't have a win over any ranked competition, so kind of hard to see them making that fight either. So not really sure who they're going to set Stamp Fairtex up with next to defend her belt. I do know that Ritu Phogat will be returning to One Championship for her next fight. Apparently she had signed with this organization called Kumite One League in India, but she was still under One Championship contract, so that's not happening. She will be back in One for her next fight. She's already fought and lost against Stamp Fairtex, but she's at least another person to throw into the mix for other contenders to fight. So probably next we're going to get Stamp Fairtex versus Denise Zambawanga, but there's really not much else after that. At women's strawweight, this is pretty much a dead division. The champ Xiong Nan's really only viable opponent is Ayaka Miura, who she's already beaten pretty recently. Or like Stamp Fairtex moving up a weight class. And the weird thing is that Ayaka Miura is already scheduled to fight at atomweight in January, leaving Xiong with literally no one to fight. I have no idea what they're going to do with strawweight. Meng Bo was a viable contender, but for some reason they didn't act on that fight when they had it, so here we are. So of these weight classes, featherweight, as you saw, definitely the healthiest of all these divisions. It's the only one I would really say is truly healthy. Then you look at men's flyweight, strawweight, and welterweight. These divisions maybe have 1, maybe 2 contenders at the ready, but still need a little bit of work. And then you look at bantamweight, heavyweight, and atomweight. These divisions maybe have a contender at the ready, maybe not. It kind of depends on some scheduled fights, or there needs to be a number 1 contender fight for that to happen. And then you look at lightweight, middleweight, light heavyweight, and women's strawweight. These are ghost towns, folks. There are literally no contenders, no one in these divisions for the champions to fight, unless One Championship basically just signs someone from outside of the organization. In short, I'd say we have enough title fights to last us maybe until the end of next summer, maybe into next fall. But folks, all these titles are due to be defended right now. The last title fight that they had on the MMA side was in October, and that was an interim title fight. So all of these divisions need some activity, and now. So when the roster is that small, good matchmaking gets really hard because there are just so few options. When good matchmaking can't happen, mismatches happen, which means that fighters that are on the lower level can't get a win streak going to challenge for a title fight, and fighters on their upper level can't really get a good challenge out of a title fight. So it's kind of a big mess. One is different from the UFC in that a higher percentage of their athletes first come through one of their feeder shows versus outright signings, at least in recent years. In 2023, 9 MMA fighters made their debut with One Championship on the Fight Night card rather than the One Friday Fight show. And honestly, there's some pretty decent names here, but none of them really at the time gathered a whole lot of headlines with their signing. I'd say most of these fighters were pretty good signings, seeing as though their contracts were probably cheap and they only had a couple of fights to their name at the time. But again, 9 overall signings for 11 divisions. We need so much more. The big question here is, can the talent that was raised up through One Friday Fights, will that talent be ready to fight for a title when this current slate of challengers runs out? So let's now turn our attention to the new breed, the fighters that came through One Friday Fights in 2023, to see how One Championship is going to replenish their MMA divisions. As stated before, One Friday Fights contracts are typically just one fight deals. They just go one at a time for those guys. And I know this because I've worked as a manager and actually seen those contracts for myself. Here are all of the fighters that fought with One Friday Fights in 2023. That's 143 fighters. As I tab through all these fighters, by far the heftiest rosters are the ones at men's flyweight, bantamweight, featherweight, and lightweight. Just looking at these names, I'd venture to guess that this roster is much less Asian-centric than one's MMA roster has typically been in the past, and definitely more detached from Asia than One Warrior Series was. If you're looking through all these names, you'll also notice that there's a few fighters here that were already under contract with One Championship that fought in One Friday Fights for whatever reason. I don't know what the situation is with their contracts, whether they fought out their contract and signed on for single fights in One Friday Fights, or simply performed in One Friday Fights under their existing contracts. I don't know. Either way, They fought in One Friday Fights. They're here on this list, but I'll manage that here in a second. So as I'm trying to answer the question of who do we have in 2024 that can realistically refill One Championship's MMA divisions, I'm removing all the fighters here that have since fought in other promotions, potentially retired or paused their MMA career, or the fighters that had already fought in One Championship directly before fighting in One Friday Fights. I'm removing those fighters just to show you which fighters have entered the organization specifically through One Friday Fights. And also just FYI, I'm only going off of what is publicly known through social media. And now I took off all the fighters who have losing records or are coming off of a loss in order to show you who has the highest potential for One Championship to try and rebuild their divisions around in 2024. They could still continue to compete in Friday Fights or potentially fight elsewhere and then be brought back over, who knows. But these are overall the fighters most likely to be pursued by One for further employment. So there's a handful of pretty promising fighters from this batch, right? But I still think that there's a pretty big skill gap between fighters from this bunch and then champions like Jared Brooks or Stamp Fairtex. So honestly, I think it might be 2 to 3 years before we see fighters from One Friday Fights make it all the way up to the championship level. All right, so far I've given you a little bit of my opinion, but a lot of the facts and numbers behind where One's roster stands on the MMA side for now. So look for another video from me soon about why One Championship has chosen to globalize their roster and move away from an Asian-centric one. But for now, I want to give a couple things that I think One Championship can do to move their MMA divisions towards greater health to re-emerge as an MMA leader. And I know, who am I to say what they should do with their business since I'm not one behind the curtain, but nevertheless, here we are. Gonna give some very broad general things I think that they should do. First off, in my opinion, I think One has just scaled way too big, way too quickly. 4 sports, 11 MMA champions, a globalized roster, trying to hold events outside of Asia. I just don't know if they can keep up with all of it, and they clearly haven't so far, as a lot of their MMA divisions have dropped off the map. In my opinion, and this is a whole different thing, but I think One Championship would be best served if they were to cut their MMA divisions overall, just focus on MMA and kickboxing, and segment their grappling division off into its own thing with a fresh coat of paint, but neither here nor there. For MMA, for right now, I would get rid of middleweight, light heavyweight, and women's strawweight. Those are pretty much dead divisions, and essentially what I would do is just allow these champions to defend their titles, sign fighters to fight in one-off title fights, and when they're ready to move on or move to something different in the organization, close the divisions. Next, I would start to bring in the best of the Friday Fights roster and mix them in with unranked fighters from the existing One Championship fights. They're just now starting to do this a little bit, and the thing is to keep these fighters busy as often as they can compete. Give them fights, give them experience. We need new fighters to enter into the rankings. Also, I would say don't worry about putting MMA fights on these One Friday Fight shows. Let those be exclusively Muay Thai and kickboxing fights, and instead bring back One Warrior series. Let that be the way that MMA fighters enter into the promotion. And have an Asian-centric version of One Warrior series, but also have a US version, a Europe version, maybe a Brazilian version. I don't know. The point is, really put some promotional power to it, almost kind of promote it like Contender Series. I think that would be a great way to get people interested in the next crop of fighters entering the organization. Because the reality is that a lot of these MMA fights happen on the Friday Fight shows, but they're the first 2 fights of the night, and no one really pays much attention to them. And then as far as pursuing top talent outside of their organization, like going for big ticket prospects, I would honestly say One Championship is mostly safe not doing this. I think keeping who they have and aggressively trying to raise up new fighters to enter into the organization is gonna work for them eventually, but for 2 divisions, I think that they do need to look for top talent. And those divisions are atomweight and heavyweight. If you look at One Championship MMA rosters in those divisions, a lot of their biggest stars are in those divisions, and they really need to keep those divisions around. I mean, just think about how popular Stamp Fairtex and a lot of the other atomweights are. Think about Anatoly Malikin and his potential. You also got Buchecha, Amir Ali Akbari, Rug. Heavyweight has some potential, but it needs to be a lot bigger. And the truth is that One Championship didn't really get any fighters out of the Friday Fight series in 2023 to refill those divisions. So they need to find really good fighters to fight Stamp Fairtex and Anatoly Malikin really soon, because realistically they should be fighting fighters in the top 15 or 20, not someone who's on the come up, or else they're just going to beat the brakes off of them. So I think One Championship should try to go for some heavyweights and atom weights outside of their organization. So all of that is merely for the roster. Whether they can actually attract the right fighters under the current state of their contracts, make money, or make fans care enough to watch the events, that's a whole different thing. This video mainly just focused on the roster for One Championship. Let me know if you have any thoughts or questions. Drop a comment down below. Thank you so much for hanging with me and watching this. On to the next video, and enjoy the fights.